looking now at the social aspects or social tensions in the country at the time. Some conservatives thought that there were just simply too many changes in society, especially after World War II. You're seeing this peak really in the 1960s, and that the morals and values of the country were weakening under pressure. You'll see that that thought about having weaker morals and values even in the 1970s and well into the 1980s. So a couple different things to think about if you're writing an essay, a couple topics that you could possibly use. One is the civil rights movement, the other will be the women's rights movement, and also counterculture. So the civil rights movement obviously had been going on even before World War II, but things are obviously going to pick up under Martin Luther King's management of things starting in the 1950s. What is particularly new in the mid-60s is that LBJ is going to be far more supportive of the federal legislation that is trying to be passed. There are a series of civil rights laws that will be passed in the 1960s, as you know, but you'll also see an increased violence associated with some of the younger civil rights workers. So think about Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, but also after King is going to be assassinated, you're going to see violence spread out through many of the major cities. So that is of concern to many conservatives. You're looking at the women's rights movement. The women will be inspired to fight for their own equal rights because of the civil rights movement, and they will start to demand equal pay, access for the job equality, and also the control over their own bodies, which obviously will be either birth control, but also abortion, which will be the controversial Supreme Court decision in 1973, Roe v. Wade. So these are what they're saying is that our society is going to be changing too quickly, and that now women want equal rights, and they want to be able to control their own destiny. It was making some people a little too uncomfortable. Then you have the counterculture. Mostly this is going to be mid-1960s on into the 1970s. This is not a majority of young people in America at the time, but it is a significant enough of a minority of young people that will make people wonder, have we turned this corner of not listening to our parents, not respecting the government? These are young people that are basically going to disregard what their parents said to do in a very traditional way. They are going to live a modern lifestyle, so to speak, that will involve free love. They will experiment with drugs. They will also be the ones that will be listening to that dangerous rock and roll music, or the ones that are slightly more edgy rock and roll music. Many will be anti-war, and they will participate in the anti-war protests. And so conservatives thought that too many of these social changes were happening in too short amount of time, and they are to blame for higher crime rates, higher divorce rates, and a looser moral standard in the country. So let's look at some of the key people involved in this. The first one we're going to give credit to is going to be Senator Barry Goldwater. He is going to be running for the presidency in 1964, but he was popular in the 1950s because he believed that really the government should take a step back and should be less involved in our lives. Again, that quote here, my aim is not to pass laws, but to repeal them. His platform was simple: to defeat communism, to reduce the size of the federal government by repealing some of those New Deal policies. He was going to run against JFK in 1964, and very early polls were showing that he could give Kennedy a close election. But obviously, Kennedy's assassination is going to change all that. LBJ is going to win by a landslide. And some thought that maybe that new conservative movement was maybe gone. It's really only temporarily sidelined. It's not going to be completely gone. LBJ does a good job at painting Goldwater as a dangerous type of extremist, and I know that we looked in class the Daisy Girl ad, basically associating Goldwater with basically starting a nuclear war. But Goldwater's legacy is going to outlive him. His ideas and message are not lost on many of the younger generations. So these are men and women that will be inspired by him, that will go on to politics with a more conservative agenda. They will be the ones behind Ronald Reagan. They will be the ones behind passing certain legislation throughout their own state legislature. So it's not all gone. It's just going to fade off a little bit, but then come back again in the 1970s and 80s. Ronald Reagan. He obviously, we know him as more of a B actor, or that's how people knew him back then. He surprised many people with his race for the governor seat in California in 1966, and he will be governor for 8 years. He was known as a conservative as well as an actor, but really he had no prior public office experience before governor. So he is, kind of a surprise. As governor, he is going to cut and trim state expenditures. He will make the state government more efficient, and he does not hesitate in making more controversial decisions. For instance, the welfare reform that he does in his state. So by the mid-1970s, people are starting to think maybe he could run for the presidency. So looking at what will happen to this with the new conservative movement will somewhat split off into two separate branches, the New Right and also the neoconservatives. So thanks to Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, there's now the two branches of this movement. Well, the New Right is going to be created during Ford's short but controversial term because he is going to select a liberal as his vice president, which is going to be Nelson Rockefeller. And then the neoconservatives are going to be Democrats who are disappointed that McGovern, who was going to run for the presidency in 1972, that he was just overall a disappointment. So out of these two groups, you've got to find someone that's going to be able to unify these two groups and somewhat create a new political movement out of this. This person is going to be Ronald Reagan. He will be considered the great unifier of these two groups, and just in time for the 1980 election to help him win. So who is or who was a neoconservative? They tend to support the use of government to solve problems, especially in foreign policy. Again, hard on communism. They don't support some of the more liberal policies of the past, such as welfare and such as Medicare. Some neoconservatives were at one time liberal-minded Democrats, but they were disillusioned. They were unhappy with the changes in the morals and the American character since the 1960s. Who was a member of the New Right? They tend to have a distrust of government. They hate communism, so that's one thing that both groups do have in common, which of course that Ronald Reagan's going to be very successful with. They also do not like liberal policies and all the changes that had resulted from those policies. So again, they're very anti-counterculture, they don't believe in abortion, and they're very anti-affirmative action. So Ronald Reagan. His election in 1980 was made possible thanks to these two powers being unified. He had a landslide victory, mostly, for two big reasons. One, Carter was not a very effective president. He didn't really have firm control over the economic issues at the time, and also the Iran hostage crisis plays out on TV every day, and Carter seemed very he showed he didn't have the ability to end this, even though he does well in foreign policy with what happens in the Middle East, and that was just not enough for him. So and people were starting to question whether or not he could lead us out of any bad situation. People were not feeling very proud to be American. Part of that is called the Vietnam syndrome, that we're never going to win again, that we're never going to accomplish anything. So really, Reagan is going to touch on all of those issues. He promises to be tough on communism. He's going to cut spending and taxes, and he's going to make America great again. And I use that quote because that was one of his slogans. All right, foreign policy. He has to make some tough decisions here, and his decision really is to be tough with the USSR, at least in his first term. His second term, he's going to change his tone just a little bit. But Reagan was a smart guy. He studied up on what was happening in the Soviet Union, and he knew that internally the Soviet Union was starting to crumble, and so he wanted to put some more external pressure on the Soviets. So by two different ways. One is going to be the Reagan Doctrine, that he's going to promise to support any group, whether they are rebel group or the mainstream government group. And if you are fighting communism, then we are there to help you. This is why we get involved in Latin America, and that will eventually lead us to the Iran-Contra affair.